Well, good Friday morning, or as I like to say to my middle schoolers, Fry-yay. Welcome to 5B as in boy, Brainspotting, Power Therapy for Adoption Constellation. Our presenter that we are so lucky to have back again with us today is Brooke Randolph. Brooke Randolph is the founder and director of counseling at the Greenhouse in Indianapolis, Indiana. Brooke is a therapist, author, speaker, and trainer who specializes in adoption therapy and developmental trauma, brain spotting, and relationships. I'm Kate Doyle Bunker. I am a family support specialist in the Hudson Valley, and I will be your moderator for Zoom today. I'd like to remind everyone that you are capable of getting training certificates, but you might want to wait till the end of your conference experience to put in for your training certificates, so all of your experiences are accounted for, but the link is in our chat already. I'd also like to note that if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, unless, of course, our presenter asks specifically for people to come off of their mute. And in our chat, you'll also see that we have a link to our book table. Not only are a variety of books related to the conference available, but also any book that you buy from our distributor in the month of May will benefit the coalition. And of course, we have an evaluation because we want to know from you how we're doing. And at that, I will turn over to Brooke. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Okay, so I am going to really quick, actually, I'm going to do a quick poll here and find out who's in the room. This just helps me know what things to emphasize as we go through. So if you guys could do that really quick, and then I'm going to grab a link for you while you answer those things. Okay, so I put in the chat where you can get a handout of the slides if you would like to see that. And I'm seeing there's lots of parents and some professionals here too. Oh, maybe 50-50 on that. Okay, that gives me a good idea. Oh no, we're still answering. We're going to give you a second. See if I can see all of this. Give everybody a chance to check in. Okay, looks great. Thank you guys for helping me with that. And I'm going to get started. Oh, I get to share the results so you guys can see it too. That's fun. Okay, share my screen here. And now once I do this, I can't see what it looks like. So you guys see just my one slide, right? Nothing weird?
Correct.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we're going to talk about brain spotting here. And so who am I? Katie told you a little bit. So I am a therapist, author, speaker, and trainer. I am licensed in Indiana, in Massachusetts, and Kentucky also. You can see those books that I've helped contribute to. And I am also a brain spotting trainer. I do the brain spotting with adoption specialty course. I run kind of a Facebook group for therapists who are wanting to learn more and do consultation. And I will be doing my first international phase 1 training later this year. And then she mentioned my group practice is based in Indiana. Abby Hasbury is a beautiful face in that group, and she is making us expand to Texas this year. And we're looking to expand to Kentucky and possibly even Wisconsin in the next year. So we've got, lots of different potentials going on. But I'm just really proud of this group of people who are all committed to ongoing growth personally, professionally, and spiritually, and to always be learning, and especially to always be learning about adoption. If those of you who have met me before know I can be kind of passionate. And so making sure that they are always learning so that we can provide the most excellent care that we can. And I am also a single adoptive mom in a open international adoption to a teenage rugger. That picture's almost a year old, and he is significantly larger now as I look at that picture. I have a rugby player um, in all extents of the word. Um, but I also want to make sure that I state or recognize that the privilege and power that goes along with being an adoptive parent. And I think it is a role and a responsibility that I take very seriously, not just in parenting, but in using my voice to advocate. Because I know politicians and others don't may listen to me more than adoptees or birth parents. And so I can help elevate those voices and also use my own to get the message out. And I think that's an important responsibility. Um, so I'm not going to look at the chat while I speak because I think most of the time when I present, I like to just take questions as we go. I love teaching from questions, but I think this one we need to do kind of the story at least first before we move through. So I won't be looking at the chat, but I will have a time for you guys to ask questions in a little bit. Okay. So Brainspotting was discovered by Dr. David Grand, who was a master EMDR trainer, and he had developed what he called natural flow EMDR, which integrated somatic experiencing and insight-oriented relational therapy to help create what was said to be a gentler version of EMDR for clients who are, and I emphasize this, too fragile for the standard EMDR approach. And he found that he was able to achieve deeper results. His office is in Manhattan. So after 9/11, he was very attuned to trauma reflexes, even very tiny ones that he was noticing in the people around him, but particularly his clients. Now I'm going to tell you a story. I prefer stories. So, Brainspotting was discovered in 2003 when Dr. Grand was working with a 16-year-old figure skater who couldn't master the triple toe loop. So, if anyone knows anything about figure skating, which isn't me, right, I'm a rugby mom, but apparently the triple toe loop is not the most challenging of jumps, and she could do more challenging feats, but she couldn't get this one. So she and David had been working together in intensive therapy, doing 90-minute sessions every week for over a year. And on this day, they were doing the natural flow EMDR, targeting the moment that the jump went awry. And so in the natural flow EMDR, he's moving his fingers slowly across and she's tracking it with her eyes. And he found that as he got to a place, he said her eyeballs wobbled and froze, and he felt like something reached out and grabbed his hand and held it still. And as he did, he said a torrent of new material came out. And in addition to the new material that came out, some of the traumas that she had processed in this last year came back up and they were able to process through to a deeper level. And some of these traumas were related to her figure skating, but many of them were also related to her family of origin. The next day, she called David from the skating rink and said that she had done the jump, the triple toe loop, not once or twice, but 3 times. And she never had that problem again, at least none that she's ever reported to any of us. So he began to look for these eye anomalies with other clients. And so then he would hold their gaze at that, whatever point it was that he noticed their eyeballs wobble or freeze. And so then he started noticing other reflexes. And those reflexes can be anything from like an eyebrow raise to I've seen clients nod. So he's noticing all these reflexes. And when he's holding the eyes still in that position, the clients were reporting that the processing was deeper and more powerful and some said they felt it all the way in the back of their head. Now, as a trainer, many of David's clients were also therapists. And so when he tried it with them, he told them to go try it with their clients. And they came back and reported similar powerful experiences. And so it quickly grew, and we began to see the impact through several caseloads. So then we had to say, well, what is this thing? So it's a hypothesized that a brain spot is activity in the subcortical brain, which is where memory and emotion are stored, in response to internal focus and eye position. When a brain spot is activated, the deep brain appears to reflexively signal the therapist, sometimes beyond the awareness of the client's neocortex, that this important spot has been located. Brain spotting appears to bypass the neocortex to access the subcortical limbic system and the brainstem. So we say it is seen as a physiological approach with psychological consequences. Okay, so why brain spotting? Why do we do this? So this is something that we say a lot in brain spotting. What's in the body is in the brain. What's in the brain is in the body. We integrate that somatic and body experience in a way that enhances and allows the brain to process more quickly whatever may be stuck. That it's not just a memory, but it is also that somatic experience, and we connect the two, connecting the brain and the body. In fact, the processing that we see in brain spotting can be emotional, it can be physical, it can be a combination, or it can be just one of those. And I've had cases, even with young children, where the processing for them is purely physical. They have no memories that go with it. They have no emotions that go with it. They're just one case that's coming up for me right now is a kid who he felt itching in his body, and the itching moved through his body, and then when he was done, he was done. So my guess is many, but we'll say some of you have had an experience of knowing a child who thought it was so much fun to jump out from behind a door or sneak up behind you and scare you, right? And maybe some of you had the experience that when you had this enjoyably ornery child who wanted to scare you, that you may have had the experience where you found yourself here stopping yourself from like pushing or hitting, maybe even, which we would never consciously hit a child. But we know that 80% of sensory information, what you see, hear, smell, etc., it all goes directly into the midbrain, again, where the memory and emotion are stored, before the neocortex is aware of it. And that midbrain is on the lookout for danger. And if something reminds the midbrain of potential danger, then it's going to communicate directly to the body before sending messages to the neocortex. And that's why we can start like to push back before we recognize, oh, this is a child, and stop ourselves, because the amygdala said, oh, this is danger, and we started to react. So that flipping your lid, what you would have heard from Dan Siegel, or what people refer to as the lizard brain, is that's what we call about it in our kids, but it's the same thing. Same as when your child jumps out to scare you. So that lizard brain is trying to keep you safe when there's even a hint of danger. Or when maybe a foster mom gets a haircut that is similar to someone else that in that past of their life that makes the child very uncomfortable. The midbrain responds 10 times as quickly as the neocortex. So we're never going to stop trauma reactions by working with the neocortex, trying to think or talk our way out of trauma. Talk therapy is going to really struggle to impact reactivity based on memory and emotion, especially when it is implicit memory and things that they may not have a narrative for, things that happened generally before age 3. I have one adult client who, after a year of cognitive behavioral therapy, came to me and he could explain why he was reactive. He could explain the traumas and the fears involved, but nothing changed for him until he started brain spotting. And this is going to be so much more true for our kids who are still developing their neocortex, whose brain development may be delayed because of trauma. The brain is still developing into the mid 20s at best, but when there is trauma, it is often into the mid 30s for the brain to get fully developed. Trauma overwhelms the brain's processing, leaving pieces of unprocessed experiences frozen in time and space. And the brain has between 1 and 4 quadrillion synaptic connections, more than the number of stars in the universe. So if we only recall an incident with anxiety, then we actually give it more negative energy by strengthening those self-protective synaptic connections. Okay, so one of the examples for this was if you imagine the quarterback that gets blindsided, and then he starts to change his speed, his form, his muscle tension, anticipating that this could happen again because now he's had that experience. And then when he starts to tell the story again to a reporter and his coaches, maybe his wife, and all of these things help guard up from that single experience because he's talking about it, afraid that it could happen again. Whereas in brain spotting, we work with the parts of the brain that are involved with regulation. So rather than top down talk therapy, the goal is bottom up regulation. The neocortex is not involved with regulation, it doesn't have that ability, but there are parts of the brain where we can process that also help keep the body regulated. And so when we process negative experiences from a place that allows us more regulation, then we are strengthening regulation connections rather than anxiety. Or, as I like to tell my clients, our brains all have the same superpower as Wolverine. It's just learning how to access it. And every kid wants to be a superhero. So I'm going to describe for you the 3 core ways of finding brain spots. But first, I want to do a really quick and easy demonstration for you. So I want all of you, just give me a minute here, and I want you to think about something in the last week or two that would be kind of mid-range on that activation scale. Okay, we're not talking trauma here. We're not talking like I'm going to lose myself because then we're going to have to, have Katie go and calm you down and right while I finish talking. So we want to just think mid-range, right? Like mild road rage. Something that you can bring yourself back from. Okay, but I want you to think about something that was upsetting. Somebody cut you off in traffic, your boss was really unfair to you, there was, what is that thing? And as you think about that incident, that experience that was upsetting to you recently, I want you to notice what that feels like in your body. Is your stomach turning? Are your palms sweating? Is your head pounding? Where do you notice the activation in your body? Okay, now pay attention to that feeling in your body. And I want you to look straight ahead at your computer screen. Just look straight and notice what that feels like in your body. Now just let your eyes move all the way to your left and notice what that feels like in your body. And then try all the way over to your right. Can you notice that where you look affects how you feel? Is there an eye position where you feel more of that somatic experience than another? So in outside window brain spotting, the therapist observes the client's eyes, face, and body reflexes while we move very slowly across their field of vision. Very slowly. I'm not even, okay. And so we may notice a reflex even when the client isn't aware of that. And so that's when the subcortical brain is feeling a sense of connection and attunement when the therapist then recognizes that, oh, here's an important spot. So the client may not even know that that's an important spot cognitively, but when the therapist goes, oh, I see the reflex, and we pause, that there is a sense of attunement. We call this outside window because we are finding the brain spot from outside of the client, or the window into the processing. We're finding it from outside of the client. And that's what David first noticed. That's what happened with the figure skater. But as he worked with clients looking for those reflexes, he would be going and looking for the reflex, and some of them would say, hey, you missed it. It was back here. And he asked them how they knew, and they said, well, I felt it. So in inside window brain spotting, the therapist and client together locate the brain spot because through the client's felt sense of highest somatic activation. So if in our demo, that really brief looking, you were able to notice and you had that recognition of your felt sense, then inside window, finding the spot from inside of the client may be really great for you. But I bet many of you have also had a time where you've noticed yourself simply gazing or staring at some spot on the floor or maybe the ceiling. You've noticed yourself looking away or up or anywhere else when you're thinking about something you want to say, particularly when that subject is loaded emotionally. As a therapist, you start to really notice that there's a lot of gazing happening. And so this is really just intuitive gazing that the client is doing, and that we can utilize that as a therapist to, notice that their brain is doing this automatically and simply hold that position. So despite the neurobiological imperative of brain spotting, it's still a highly relational process. And this relational attunement is foundational and super important to me, is why this is important to the adoption constellation. The therapist doesn't engage less necessarily, but we do engage differently than in other therapies. We very much emphasize what they call the dual attunement, simultaneous awareness of both the neurobiological, what is happening on the client's face and body and brain, and the relational and what is happening between the therapist and the client. And this fits in with the model of interpersonal neurobiology from Dan Siegel. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this more later. But this idea of dual attunement helps create a frame around the client, holding relationally and neurobiologically together, that can expand the window of tolerance, that feeling of safety and that feeling of someone else being aware allows them to go deeper and to process more deeply. So for a brain spotting therapist, one of the most common analogies we use is we say that the client is like the head of the comet, and the tuned a therapist is like the tail of the comet that follows the head. As brain spotting therapists, we do not assume. We notice what is happening with curiosity and focus on the client, not our own hypotheses, not coming up with questions, and not trying to lead the way in a protocol. Intervention is to be used minimally and temporarily as possible, as the goal of brain spotting is accessing those self-healing capacities within the client. We remember to wait, WAIT, which reminds us, why am I talking? And Santiago Brand is a Colombian therapist who now lives in Singapore. And he has been doing some research that is really supporting that. And I'm going to highlight a little bit of it later. But the client is able to go deeper into the subcortex when the therapist is not speaking. Brain spotting is an open, creative, integrative model designed to be adapted into any clinical approach and therapeutic style. You don't have to stop TheraPlay to integrate brain spotting. We have brain spotters that specialize in addictions, sports, performance, military. We integrate internal family systems, somatic experiencing, sand tray, all kinds of things can come together. So Dr. Grand helped me write an article in 2017 when I was earlier trained about why I think brain spotting is the preferred therapy for adoption and can be so beneficial for, that was written for adoption today. So it was written more for adoptees, but I really think, particularly birth mothers, some of the very similar things go along. But obviously, I believe in it for the entire adoption constellation. Obviously, that was 5 years ago, and I think my understanding of brain spotting has deepened, and I would love to do a refresh on that article one of these days when I have more time. So let's go back to the very beginning and using that natural flow EMDR, which integrated the somatic experiencing what's in the body and the insight-oriented relational therapy to create that gentler version of EMDR for clients too fragile for the standard approach or protocol. That overwhelm was always one of my concerns with EMDR. I am very protective and find that adoptees who've had major changes or trauma at a young age are particularly susceptible to overstimulation. And holding the eye still is more containing the rapid eye movements of EMDR. So if you think about it as, you're staring down this tiger on your screen, like if that was in person, like that would be intense. But imagine, see, I'm not on a stage, so I can't do this for you, but imagine how much more intense it would be if that tiger is walking back and forth and keeping an eye on you. And that is more activating, is a good therapeutic term, than just that contained of that fixed eye position. And even when their eyes are not moving, as they have made some changes to the EMDR protocols, as someone myself who has a secure attachment raised in my biological family, those tappers that they use, I find extremely overstimulating. I don't even want to be in the same room with them. So there is something about that can be overstimulating to some people. Now, I have sensory sensitivities. Not everyone finds those overstimulating, but the awareness is important to me. And that in brain spotting, we never force activation, but that we have several options to turn down the intensity in any moment of the process. And so several different ways that we can do that. So the dual attunement I think is essential when working with adoption. When we are wounded in relationship, we heal in relationship. You cannot have good adoption therapy without attunement. And actually, I want to go back to that idea about attunement. You can't have good adoption therapy without attunement, and you cannot be attuned to whoever is front of you if you are leading the way. If, as a therapist, I am telling you, do this and this and this to get there, that we have to respect the individual to know what is good for them. And I'm probably jumping ahead of myself in my slides, but so many in the adoption constellation have not had the experience of being respected to know what is good for them. And that many people have told them this is the process that you have to follow. And I think particularly of adoptees and birth parents in this, but I think some foster and adoptive parents would feel that also. So mirroring, reflecting a person's words back to them is what we would be how we would describe mirroring in therapy. Communicates that I see you, I hear you, you are here, you matter. But when we go back to infancy and human development, we are mirrored into existence. Those that we match those faces, and we just think about how you interact with a baby. Oh, you're so upset. Oh, you're moving your hand. Oh, you're like, we are mirrored into existence. But for a variety of reasons, this may not have occurred in childhood appropriately for those who are in the foster care or adoption systems. So that makes it not just powerful, but a really essential experience for them. And the idea of the comet communicates that they can be trusted, that they know what they are ready for. Um, and as I said, they have not always had that experience of knowing what is best for them. And I find it so healing for a therapist to say, okay, you're ready to go there. Let's go there. I'm with you. Not that like, well, that could be really intense. Let's back down. Or for a therapist to say, well, I really think you need to go there. And when they're saying, I'm not sure I'm ready. And so for the therapist instead to say, okay, let me know when you're ready. Does this feel better for you? Whatever this might be. And so this is where I typically say societally, adoptees are treated as perpetual children, lacking the same respect and rights as non-adoptees. When I give this to professionals outside of our community, then my next slide is always about the access to OBCs. But I didn't think that was necessary for this group. Brainspotting is very flexible. It is an art and a science. So as I've kind of mentioned, we're teaching guidelines, not a protocol. We want to follow our clients. Some clients like gaze spotting, others like using a pointer. Some like to have music and some don't. And it allows us to change things in the moment to fit the client's need. And I think that's really essential when working with the adoption constellation. Rather than us telling them, let them tell us. And the possibility of silent healing, so not talking to a therapist, is attractive to many people for many different reasons. But as we think, particularly of children who may be embarrassed about the things they've experienced, or they may not even have English words for those events, or that may have been too young to be able to have it matching with words and narrative. The ability to process things without speaking them out loud, and that for that to be very normal for the therapist, I think is important. Okay, so what is the research? So Brainspotting is less than 20 years old. So published research is minimal, as research takes many years to get to publication. And if you go to brainspottingindy.org, it's Indy, INDY, as in Indianapolis. On the media page, this is a screenshot from it. I have put up the different research articles that have been published. And I'm going to particularly highlight this one by Dr. Javier Andrade of Spain. And he conducted this research into effective treatments for general anxiety disorder. It is not published in a way that works really well for like American universities and such things, but I think it's really important and I want to highlight it. So he compared the effectiveness of cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, and brain spotting to a control group. And he used the state trait anxiety inventory, separated into states and traits, and the Beck anxiety inventory. And SUDS is the subjective units of disturbance or distress. And so that's just someone asking on a scale of 0 to 10, how big is this for you? Okay, so that's what he's comparing. Let me make this make more sense. So first, I want you to notice that each of the control groups, there was no significant change in the anxiety, while all three interventions did produce significant changes. So we can infer from this that brain spotting is as effective as EMDR and cognitive behavioral therapy, which are both considered evidence-based therapy. And evidence-based is the designation that is given after you reach a high number of research studies published in peer-reviewed journals. Okay. The notable difference, what really stands out to me, is not the change after the intervention, that pre-test to post-test, but if the change stuck for the follow-up 6 months later. So with brain spotting, we see continued improvement even following the intervention, which we're not seeing for either CBT or EMDR, which may have stayed about the same-ish, but not that continued improvement. Okay, so this isn't actual data. I borrowed these images as to like illustrate for you what I'm going to tell you about. And some of you may be familiar with CALO programs. It's a residential program that specializes in developmental trauma. Scott Konecki is their neurotherapy director, and he showed me similar QEEG test results from these. And from a before, after, and then a few weeks later of how brain spotting normalized brainwave patterns for their adolescents. So as far as I know, he hasn't had time to write this up yet, but I hope that he does and that this gets published someday. And I mentioned to you Santiago Bryant. He has posted this research for brain spotting therapists to look at, but he's still in the midst of it. But this shows the changes that happen in the brain during brain spotting. And so he's circled to kind of highlight those things. And he's looking at a lot of data from EEG studies during brain spotting, showing the attunement of the therapist to the client is one of his research focuses. And so I'm actually highlighting for you all the things that aren't published rather than the things that are. But you can go back to brainspottingindy.org if you want to see those that are. And then this is a screenshot from the Sandy Hook survey in 2016. Dr. Grand, Martha Jacoby, I think there was another brain spotting trainer who all did volunteer work after Sandy Hook. And so their organization did a survey every year about all of the therapies that had been provided. And this is showing who rated it. So the clients then rated what was the most effective for them. And as you can see, they found that brain spotting was very effective or effective above these other therapies. And it's actually, I mean, it's a PDF, so it's in 8.5 by 11. So I just cut it off on what would fit on my slide at one point. but you can go and find that. Okay, so tools and techniques, just a brief introduction of some of the parts of the parts of brain spotting, because people often ask, what does it look like? But also so any parents can have a clear idea how it can benefit and what to advocate for. So I said that it's very flexible. We can choose different paths to start, but we can also make changes at any time. So to start, we have two main models, what would be the activation model and the resource model. And so to think about the activation model as the interstate that, you're going to go direct and fast, while the resource model is a bit slower, like a country road or a highway that runs along the interstate. But what we find is that for some people, getting off the interstate and taking the side road gets them there more quickly and more smoothly. And so neither is wrong. Both sometimes the side road is faster. And we also have the expansion model. So not like processing things out, but expanding towards possibilities, healing, those positive feelings. And this is really helpful when we think about our kids who may not be all that interested in processing, but they might be interested in improving their sports performance. And we can work on their sports performance and know that the brain's going to go where the brain needs to go. And even as we focus on sports performance, whatever is getting in their way, which may be other past traumas, will come up and the brain can process through. So we don't always use a pointer, but it's a basic tool and a cute story. Dr. Grand found that holding his hand still in any spot for 20 to 90 minutes could become kind of painful and problematic. So he remembered that his father had been an international lecturer and used a pointer like this in his lectures. And so he pulled that out and tried it, and we've stuck with that. Now, many of the pointers from the original training have a red tip that can be too phallic in nature for those with a history of sexual abuse. So we have, so you can see I keep my finger puppets on them. I use pointers that have just a simple ball. There's lots of ways that we can get creative. You can use Post-it notes or pictures. So advocate for your kids and advocate for yourself in saying what is helpful or important. The bilateral music is different than bilateral. I will pull an article up on this because I have written one. Different than bilateral. In that it is hand panned to go up in one ear and then down and then up in the other ear and down. So bilateral stimulation goes in a predictable pattern back and forth. And the bilateral, because it is hand panned, cannot be predicted by the brain. So the brain can't tune it out. That has to have some awareness of it, but we keep the volume very low so it becomes background and it helps integrate the two parts of the brain. And this fancy schmancy glasses here, and I have a matching one that blacks out the other side. They help us isolate the eyes, which helps us isolate which hemisphere of the brain we are accessing. And so this is one of those ways that we can turn up or turn down the intensity as we need it. And also when we are in telehealth sometimes, or just because kids think it's cool to be a pirate, we might use an eye patch instead. You can do brain spotting with your eyes opened or your eyes closed. And another way we can increase specificity and also turn up and down the intensity is that we can use all axes. So X, Y, and Z coming towards you. And that we find that the Z axis, having things close or far, can be related to your attachment and your discomfort or your comfort with things near or far. And I talked to therapists about how this is not diagnostic, that if it is, they have a preference one or the other than it tells you something about this individual, because, you know, it may be very related to their experiences and feeling that they have been left, or maybe they are very happy about being left. And just, we want to always take it individual by individual. Another way that we use this is called vergence. I don't want to go too deep into this, so I will drop you guys a YouTube video. Um, I am not a YouTuber, not my best work, but I have it. So I'm going to give it and I'll share it, and then maybe someday I'll record it. This isn't a great picture, but it's what I could find. So the idea is that if a child is in a deep traumatic memory or even a flashback, we may utilize a parent to insert themselves into the child's line of sight to help change that memory or help to call the child out of the flashback, depending on what is needed in this case. Um, while I rarely see this level of disassociation in children, I have used this with adults and put myself on the floor so that my face could be there as a comforting, grounding presence in the midst of that deep processing. So we have very creative ways that we utilize parents and caregivers um, in those things. So for the parents in the room, I think there are ways that we can use our foundations of Brainspotting to help you be a more therapeutic parent. And these may not be things you've been taught directly in therapeutic parenting, but I'd like to talk about it, see what works for you. Okay, so again, back to dual attunement. This is foundational. Relationship, relationship, relationship. We are attuned to the brain, body, and words of our client. So I want you to be attuned to the brain, body, and words of your children. Yes, sometimes they lie through their teeth, but their words generally share their emotional reality, even if it's not an objective reality. Okay, so think about it. It doesn't matter what the truth is. What their words are telling you is about their current emotional state. Our neurobiological attunement helps us to understand the brain. And Dan Siegel is a really great place to start in reading that for parents. I definitely encourage that to understand your child's brain and how the brain responds in trauma. Also, Gabor Mate and Stephen Porges are really great leaders in that field. And as I said, as you mirror to your child what you notice in him or her, you are encouraging a sense of connection in your child's brain. Remember that the subcortical brain appears to feel a sense of connection and attunement that the neocortical brain doesn't understand when we are responding to what we notice in the client. Notice and respond. I get how easy it is to want to ignore certain things, but when you notice and respond, and I'm not talking about correcting, but just noticing, especially the good things, then you're building that interpersonal neurobiology. Okay, so with this, Dan Siegel said this to ATN, the Attachment and Trauma Network, about interpersonal neurobiology and adoption. He says that adoptive parents become biological parents because parenting biologically changes the brain. I personally feel way more comfortable with the term neurobiological if I'm going to go there, but I mean, you can't, Dan Siegel is the expert, right, on the brain. And I think he said this to empower adoptive parents to recognize that they have an impact on the child's brain. And I think that's the important point, not this term biological. It makes me uncomfortable. I would go with neurobiological, but I can't correct Dan Siegel either. Okay, so humans believe that if we know that we have some sort of power or safety. And that is not how the world works. We want to believe that's true. It is not true. We don't have to know everything, and we can't. You don't have to know what it is to know that it is. You don't have to know what set off your child to know that there's emotional distress. You may not ever know what that trauma is, but you know that it is. And you may know, like, hey, I'm going to avoid these kinds of things in the future. And so we don't always have to know the whys to just respond to the needs. Okay. Remember, the brain spotting therapist, the client is like the head of the comet. The attuned therapist stays in the tail, and we follow very closely where the client leads. So it could mean that the client's always right, but really means that we trust the clients to know themselves. So if your child asks a question, answer it. Okay. Sometimes you might want to say, well, what do you think the answer is as the start? But you always want to answer their questions. If they ask, then they're ready to know. Empower your child to speak up for themselves, what they need and they want. As much as you know your child, you cannot know more about them than they know. And I know that can be hard because our kids, like, they have a very childlike perception of themselves, and they don't, you know, like, they think Cheetos are good for dinner. Like, there are things like that where we're like, well, not really. But also, they know their experience, and they can understand their um, distress and that how big that is better than you can. Okay, so I said brain spotting intervention is to be used as minimally and temporarily as possible because we're accessing the self-healing capacities within the client. But as parents, we can wait also. I know that this has improved my relationship with my child if I just stop engaging. I live with a teenage Enneagram 8 who recognizes that he's an Enneagram 8. Um, and like sometimes I just have to stop. It's we just I'll wait and let him have whatever he needs to say. But if I keep engaging, it's just going to continue. And it doesn't do any good for anyone's relationship. Parents, be flexible. That is a good reminder always. And when you notice your child gazing, whether that's out the car window or at a spot on the floor, you really may just want to let it be. That they are probably processing and their brain is doing good work when they are looking away. So I really actually, that whole like look at me thing, we don't need to require eye contact. Eye contact can be some like an important like life skill to learn, but it isn't always helpful when we're upset or in a very stressed situation. The eye contact spot is really powerful for brain spotting, um, but there's a time and a place for everything. And inviting eye contact is different than telling someone to look me in the face when you talk to me. And you can also ask your child if it helps them to feel better when they look here or here. You don't need a pointer. You can use whatever's in your room. Um, you could ask them if they want to put something like to put their picture somewhere to mark it, um, or use a stuffed animal or a toy car, anything for them. And so you can make it really playful with little kids, you know, like, oh, where do you think he needs to be to help you feel better? Oh, what is what does this giraffe have to tell you about his story? And any little piece like that. As I said, eye contact is very connecting and grounding as a brain spot. Um, and parents can use this cradle position even with your big kids when they talk about tough stuff that can be super therapeutic. So let me say two parts of this. My big kid way outweighs me. But if we've got a couch, I can still hold his head in a cradle position. And also, I am never going to force regression. This is an invitation if the child wants it. This is not a thing that we force on them. That we offer the nurturing, we offer and allow them to choose regression if that is what they emotionally need. I don't even like the term regression in that place, but we are never going to force that regression on them. Okay, we're about done here. And I'm going to answer all the questions because I love answering questions. So if you are looking for a brain spotting therapist, Constellation trained means they trained with me. They did my specialty training, which is a 3-day training on brain spotting with adoption. It is an introduction to adoption competency as well as some specific brain spotting skills. If they are not Constellation trained, then I would find someone who is an adoption specialist. And then a brain spotting trainer is going to be the most trained and skilled, then a consultant, certified, trained. When I first learned about brain spotting and learned these foundational skills, the relational attunement, the uncertainty that we're, not forcing a protocol, all of those pieces that are so important to me. I was so excited. I was like, hey, if there's not an adoption specialist in your area, go find a brain spotting therapist because they won't do any harm if they're actually doing what brain spotting is. Turns out therapists don't always pay attention to their training. And I have learned that even if they are at the training, they may not always live into all of these principles. So I now am a little bit more like, look for someone who's Constellation trained and not just anyone who's trained. And I keep a list. I keep a list of people I've trained with, people I consult with, and other therapists around the world that to know that. So this little badge here is they may or may not have that on their website, but if they complete a training with me, I send them something like that. And if you are a brain spotting therapist, I do have my specialty training up on Teachable now. Probably won't do it live again until 2023. I run consultation groups for therapists, which I love doing and meeting with therapists all around the world who want to learn more about adoption therapy. I do monthly webinars because not all therapists will go to a long training, but they will sometimes watch an hour video to learn something about the client that they are working with right now. And I know that while I would love every person in the adoption constellation to work with a specialist, that's not happening and isn't going to happen anytime soon. So I am out here to promote excellence in adoption therapy and to provide the information and tools to all therapists who are interested and help, pour into those people so we can have more excellence in adoption therapy. All right, so I'm going to stop this and take some questions. Sound good? All right. Okay, is this also an alternative for DBT? Is one of the questions that I see in the chat. So DBT is very skill-based in self-regulating skills. I wouldn't necessarily, it's not like comparing apples to oranges. Brain spotting is a little bit more process oriented, but brain spotting is an integrative approach that we can very much do both at the same time. And so finding a therapist who does both, or if you're finding that one's not working, right? Like if something doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. And so we just move on to the next thing. Yes, effective with children who have experienced sexual trauma or really any kind of traumas. Whether it's a child or an adult, if there is sexual trauma, we need to and I'm speaking to the therapist primarily right now, but we need to be very cautious and slow about both the somatic and the body connection, and pulling that in, and also you have to follow you, um, because with sexual trauma, something was forced on someone and they were very uncomfortable in their body. And so to say, like, well, let's try to find where you feel that most in your body is uncomfortable. And if we are not slow and cautious, we don't let the client lead the way, they usually see themselves out of therapy pretty fast. Um, okay, so are the webinars available to adoptive families or just professionals? Um, they're on Teachable. Anybody can get to them. And I edit them to make sure there is no client information, because sometimes therapists ask questions they shouldn't, in when they don't know who's in the world. Um, but they are designed for therapists. So like if some of the questions may be directed more towards therapy, but like I did one on feeding and nurturing in adoptive families. And I talked to therapists, but I was very aware that this was going to be one that parents were going to grab onto too. So um, I think they're all fine. Just know that they're not directed towards parents specifically. See. Okay, the difference between brain spotting and neurofeedback. So neurofeedback is taking signals from the brain and putting them on a screen, and it's, at least with kids, it's kind of gamified on their, like they're trying to get their brain to match the waves to change what's on the screen. And so it's much more physiological. Whereas with brain spotting, we're asking the client to notice internally, that internal mindfulness of what is coming up for them, and just being aware and letting it process. And we're not using any technology. Like the bilateral music is the most tech that we're really getting in with it. So it's much more therapeutic than neurofeedback, which might be more just like training. Um, so the question is, does my course cover work with young people with dissociative disorders, splitting, which would probably refer to dissociative identity disorder? We're going to mention it, but not in a like, this is what you do. Specifically, because everything, there are no symptom specific setups in brain spotting, that we are very client focused, and what is this client, given their entire life experience, um, want to address in this moment, and what is the best way to set that up for them. Typical length of therapy completely is dependent on the client situation, what they're ready for, um, what this relationship's like. So there's so much, and what we're dealing with in general in this room is developmental trauma, and that is complicated. And so it is going to be a longer experience than something that is like a car accident, which you might be able to process in 1 to 3 sessions. But developmental trauma, things that are relationally based, are usually more complicated. And even once we take off that first layer, sometime we're going to come to the next layer. I think that's just true in any kind of relational trauma, even if that relational trauma doesn't happen until you're an adult. Yes, completely successful via telehealth. There are some individuals who, because of their life experience, and the relational, they may do better in person. But I also have clients who do better via telehealth because they get to be in their own safe environment. And for me, I get to feel safe that they're in their home and they're not going to try to drive home after the experience we had. that they're not going to then later disassociate while they're driving. So there are like pros and cons on both sides. Is there anyone it's not suggested for? So Dr. Grant has said, slightly tongue in cheek, that this is for anyone with an active nervous system. But I think that there are ways that this can be utilized for everyone. And so I don't know if there's some sort of seizure disorder that your doctor says not to have a fixed eye position. But even then, I would like that we can take the basics of it, that internal mindfulness, and have them work with their eyes closed and just focus on the body and the emotion and maybe not the other pieces of it. So we can, again, it's very integrative. You don't have to necessarily do the setup as taught specifically in a training for it to the word that's coming, this is not the right word, but to improve therapy, to deepen where we're going, that we can use parts of it and help deepen, even if you don't do all of it. And I do have clients who are like don't think they're into it, but I can be a brain spotting therapist and be relationally attuned and neurobiologically attuned and notice when they are gazing off in a spot and you know, they may not. Does that, I don't know if that kind of makes sense. I don't have faces necessarily to give me the feedback on that. Like I can still do all of that attunement and awareness without necessarily saying, hold your eyes in this position, which I don't think I would say those exact words anyway, but something to that degree. Um, okay, would you say this is a good place for anyone to start who needs mental health treatment? And then go into something different based on the therapist recommendation. I don't like, I think it can be beneficial for anyone. I think the many people who start therapy think about therapy as what they see on TV. And so they're ready for talking or even like the therapist to like tell them what to do. So it's brain spotting is different than that. Like, I'm not going to tell you what to do because I'm following in the tail of the comet. So that might not be what they're expecting. But the more skilled the therapist is, it doesn't matter where we start from, we can slowly move towards a thing. And I think it really just comes into the skill of the therapist, how comfortable that is for the client. So there are people doing this with people with visual impairments. One of my team works with someone who is legally blind, but she can still hold a fixed eye position. She still has that internal felt sense. Again, we do brain spotting, eyes opened, eyes closed. So it is not necessary to have that. Again, the theory is that the positioning of the extraocular muscles is signaling to the brain. It's kind of like a pin lock. Like when we get the extraocular muscles in the exact right position, it's like signaling and opening up a file in the brain. Is kind of the analogy there. So it's more about the position of the eyes than the visual piece of it. But it is a brain body mindfulness based therapy. And if we can't get if we can't mess with the eye positions, we can still be aware of what's going on in the body and we can still encourage that internal mindfulness. We can still use the bilateral music to increase the connection hemisphere to hemisphere. So there are always pieces that we can add to any therapy. We can integrate this into anything. Are there other questions? And if you guys want to raise your hands or unmute, that's fine too. Okay, so I'm going to quickly Google over here that article I said I would find for you. And for our admins, I will make sure I get that added to the other thing also. So here is the parts of the 4 types of music used in therapy, which explains a little bit. Really, I was in a training one day and somebody asked a question, and I typed out this answer, and then they were like, "That's great. Can you publish that somewhere?" So I put it in a blog, but just kind of differentiating those.
Brooke, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you so much for your time and for the information that you brought to us. We were so lucky to be able to hear from you today and about this type of therapy. I'm sure there are a lot of us who are walking away with a great deal more knowledge to process because you were kind enough to share this with us. I just want to remind our participants that I have reposted the links for our certifications, for our book table, and for our survey. And again, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Brooke, for everything.
Absolutely.